All right, hi everybody. Welcome to Shivers. Joined us today is Heather Leah. She was on our very first episode ever, and now we are back revisiting some new content with her. So, super exciting stuff. Heather, I'll let you be the one to announce it. Can you tell us what you got coming up?
Uh, I have my first book coming out, and then a second book coming out right on the tail of the first one. Both of them are exploring ghost towns and lost communities of North Carolina. But the second one is going to focus specifically on underwater ghost towns, whereas the first one is just ghost towns on land that you can go see.
That's super cool. So, I mean, all of your stuff so far has been like North Carolina based. Is all of the stuff in book one about North Carolina as well?
Yeah, so right now the books are both about North Carolina ghost towns,
Cool.
because that's where a lot of I specialize in North Carolina history. However, I am starting to extend beyond the boundaries of North Carolina. I've been doing a lot more YouTube content and TikTok content and trying to create video. And so once these first two books come out, I will probably start to do stuff beyond North Carolina in book form as well. Though I do really want to do a book on like the coolest graveyards that you can visit. I think that would be really interesting. There's some beautiful old, historic cemeteries. Some of them are like arboretums, and some are like a secret garden. Others are abandoned, or they've been moved to an island and they're just on this abandoned island. There's so many interesting cemeteries, so I'd like to do a third book. But I do content about all of this on the web as well.
That's awesome. So, out of all of the places in specific to graveyards, what's the one that you've seen in person that you're like, oh my God, this is just the coolest?
Oh, okay. So I'll tell you two of my favorites, but it's really hard to pick a favorite, to be honest with you, because some of them are just interesting. Like, okay, just like an example, not my favorite, but an example. There is a graveyard in the middle of a mall parking lot in North Carolina, and like the whole mall is just built around this cemetery from the 1800s. There's another graveyard in the middle of a parking lot in downtown Cary. There's a lot of these old Revolutionary era cemeteries in neighborhoods. There's some cemeteries that were lost and that we knew existed, but we had to go trying to figure out where they were because they were. One of them it's off High House Road in Cary, and it was based on the family that lived in the house that was originally called the High House. And there's a whole ghost story, by the way, around High House Road and the buried treasure that this family hid. But anyway, we knew that they had buried their loved ones on their property, but we couldn't figure out where that cemetery was. So many of these cemeteries have fascinating either just history or they were like a mysterious cemetery, or they're in a really weird location. But as far as just plain beautiful cemeteries that still are rich in history, there's one in Tarboro. It's at Calvary, I think it's Calvary Baptist Church. But this cemetery, I'm gonna go see it again soon. It's just beautiful. You can just walk around there. It's got these like curving brick paths that go through these old like 1800s like Gothic style headstones, right? These tall, towering, ornate gravestones, and they have like English ivy like growing over the graves. It's was built as an arboretum, so it's got plants and trees from all over the globe, based on the gentleman who first like created the church and the cemetery. So it's got all these unique trees. It's got like, yeah, I think it's got like a redwood in there. I mean, it's beautiful old trees. These beautiful live oaks. Those are the oaks that are usually extremely old with these gnarled branches, and they just kind of creep out over the cemetery like this. And then you've got the ivy over the pathways, and these everything's got these Gothic archways that you can walk under as you go through the cemetery. If you like Gothic revival architecture, or just it's like a secret garden. I mean, it's just beautiful. And the whole cemetery is walled in,
Mm.
right? So it's that old style cemetery. you're not like out on a grassy hillside. You're in this like walled in area. It just feels like you've teleported to maybe England. It just doesn't feel like you're in North Carolina because of the style of architecture. So that one is very beautiful. Um, and then there's another one that is it's just like the burying ground. The burying ground. I have to look it up. Ye old burying ground, maybe. There's an old cemetery. It's in North Carolina along the coast. I think it's Beaufort. And the cemetery goes back to the 1700s, which it's very rare to find marked graves that old. There are many graves that old, but most of them, the markers are gone. And so finding a cemetery that goes back that far is very uncommon. But it also has just these beautiful, again, the old trees with the gnarled branches creeping out. It's got this beautiful, like again, Gothic revival style church, very Victorian. And that one has a lot of ghost stories around it too. So like there's one where like a ship captain was buried and he's got the cannon of his ship as his headstone. And then there's the girl in the rum barrel, and it's a little girl. She was like 10 years old, and she had, sorry, I'm rambling, but it's a good story. So there was this little girl, and she had begged to go on a ship. I think she wanted to go to England because her father would travel to and from England. And of course, she stayed home with her mom. But her dad always came home and she would hear stories of what it was like going overseas and going on a ship. And I believe when she was 10, she just begged her mom, please, can daddy take me with him this time? And her father promised her mother, I will take good care of her. I will bring her home again. Don't worry. Well, the little girl, she did get to go to England, but on the trip home, she fell ill and she died on the boat.
Oh,
Now, it would be tradition to cast her into the sea or bury her at sea because you don't want a body on the boat when you're sailing for months. The body's going to start to have an odor and it could spread illness, right? But her father had promised her mother he'd bring her home again. So he bought this barrel of rum, which would have been pretty expensive because it's a whole barrel. And he put her body in the barrel of rum and closed her in there. And I guess the rum would help preserve her and prevent illness from spreading. Well, when they got home, they unloaded the ship, and the mother runs to go see her daughter after months and months apart. And she opens her arms and she sees her husband coming off the ship with this barrel, and she just collapses. She just knows that her daughter is home again, but not in the form she had hoped for. And her body was in such bad condition in the barrel that they actually buried the barrel. So the barrel is what's buried under that grave. And it's the gravestone is always covered in toys and things that people leave for the little girl. Um, so that's one of my favorite cemeteries because it's very beautiful. It's got all these old graves, but then it's got these stories attached to it as well, as all cemeteries do. So sorry, that's a long answer,
yeah.
but those are two of my favorites, along with a smattering of others that I also like.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. And even from the paranormal perspective, like I have now gone to a number of cemeteries that are local, especially like Oakwood and things like that. And there's a small little cemetery that's off of Leesville Road in the center of the parking lot of the library. And it's so weird because it's just like the family that would have lived there. So it literally just looks like this patch of grass with a little fence around it. But there's almost more of a appreciation slash sadness when you go there versus when you go to these big, beautiful things. Because, you walk around Oakwood, you walk around like the places that you're talking about, and it's more about the architecture than it is the story, I think, sometimes. So, yeah, it's really wild the different almost feelings that you get from these places. And I mean, from your perspective too, I know you write a lot about from this haunted history. What is your perspective on that paranormal aspect?
Yeah. So, um, you know, I tell people all the time because I talk in front of groups, I speak to schools. And of course, the kids always want to know the ghost stories, right? More than the history. Um, what I believe is this. It's not about if ghosts are real or not real, right? And even the ghost stories and the legends, it's not about if they're true or not true. They're real to the community and to the people that tell those stories. I think that legends a lot of times do connect with ghost stories. They really help capture the spirit, if you will, of a community and of these stories that we tell ourselves about our own community and the place we live. For example, growing up, I heard all kinds of ghost stories about Raleigh. I heard the legend of Crybaby Lane and the Dorothea Dix and the old Catholic orphanage that burned down, and there's a whole legend around ghost stories and smelling sulfur coming from the abandoned half burnt down building that used to be there in the 70s. And then I was told, the stories of the Mordecai house and how, there's this woman who plays the piano inside at night when no one's there, and you can hear the music coming from the house. These stories become part of what Raleigh is, right? There's other places don't have Crybaby Lane. They don't have the Gray Lady of the Mordecai house, right? Raleigh has those things. North Carolina has legends. I love to look into these legends and figure out kind of where they originated, right? Because usually there is a real origin story. For example, I got a few here. This you've touched on it, something I'm clearly excited about. So, for example, there was this one ghost story about Acid Park. And Acid Park had to do with the whirligigs. So if you go to Wilson, you'll see there's this beautiful whirligig park. And these whirligigs were created by Wallace Simpson. And he created his first whirligig when he was overseas serving in a war. I believe it was World War II. So he was creating this art. I think he made it for more practical purposes when he was overseas, but he was creating this when he was literally at war. Then he comes home, he creates these whirligigs, and they're on his farm. And at night, the light would catch on them. They would be spinning. They're huge and tall. When I say whirligig, I mean they're these, as tall as a building or maybe taller with these, mechanical parts and the lights flashing. And his farm is on this very dark road and it has a curve that goes around. And so at night, people would see these, creepy looming, like mechanical figures with lights flashing. And there was this whole story I'd been told that I believed for a long time. I thought it was true. That he made those whirligigs because his daughter was killed in a crash in a drunk driving accident. And so he took the parts of the cars, the gnarled and twisted cars, and took those parts and built this art on this, on the curve where she died to like remember her. And so people would see the lights of Acid Park and claim that this old man would come out and chase them. So that's the story I heard long before I even knew about the whirligigs. But then I found out when I researched them, especially after he died, they did kind of go into a state of decay, and many of them are starting to they're like these giant, mechanical parts, but they are starting to get twisted and to, cave over on themselves. And his farm is on a dark stretch of road with a curve. Well, there was a crash out there, and apparently for a long time there was a car wrecked on the side of the road that was like left there to decay. And so there's where the story comes from, right? People see these lights and these shapes at night and they come up with a tale about it. And then then there is a crash there and people start kind of conflating the two and a story is born. And while, to be honest, I'm not sure that Wallace Simpson or his family would want that story to be his legacy, I will also say that story is part of why so many people know about the whirligigs. Um, Similarly, there's the story of Lydia's Bridge, and it's near High Point. I think it's Jamestown. That's your quintessential story about the Phantom Hitchhiker, right? You pull up along the side of the road. There's a girl standing in a prom dress, a white dress, and you let her in your car. and she asks you to take her home. In this case, Lydia asks you to take her home to High Point, which is maybe just a few miles down the road. Well, you take her home and you get out of the car and go around to let her out, and she's not there.
Mhm.
And then you go and you knock on the door to see if she got in okay, and an old woman answers and she goes, Lydia's been dead for 10 years, right? And that's your ghost story. Well, we have our own version of that, right? Lydia's Bridge. Well, guess what? There was a young woman named, I believe her name wasn't Lydia, but her middle initial was L. And there were historians that figured out who Lydia was historically. There was a woman who crashed there. She's buried nearby. They found her grave. These stories start to become so entwined with the history, and I think they help people who wouldn't otherwise get excited about history, to get excited about these stories and these legends. One more mermaid point. Like we literally have a legend of mermaids in North Carolina dating back to the 1700s when Revolutionary War soldiers claimed that they saw them outside of the tavern where they would be drinking, right? And they claimed that these mermaids swam up the Cape Fear from the ocean in order to wash the salt water out of their hair in the moonlight. Well, it's not about if the mermaids are real or not real. It's about all the way back in the 1700s, we have Revolutionary War soldiers telling these stories about North Carolina, and it becomes part of our mythology. So there's a million more I could talk about that, but that's how I feel about ghost stories. I think that they sort of tell us who we are as a culture and give us something to be excited about
I
and to
love
help us remember the history.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think it's some of that like childlike whimsy too that adds to that story. It's like, even as a kid, like I was never a big fan of like scary stuff and now I'm all in it, but maybe that's from the root of all that. Like even in northeastern Pennsylvania, there's this very long stretch of dark, dark road, and so it would be the Suskin Screamer, but it's the exact same story as the Lydia and her bridge. And so it's if you turn all of your lights off and you turn them back on, there's going to be a bride that's walking down the road and she's hitchhiking. You pick her up and you drop her off at her said house and then get out and they say, oh, she's been dead for this many years. So, 500 miles away, it's the same story. And then
So cool.
even in Key West, like went to Key West a couple of years ago to Fort East Martello Museum, which is where Robert the Doll is. But in that same fort, they were doing this art exhibit, and it was almost exactly the same as like the whirly gigs that you were talking about. It's these like metal structures with these lights that come from kind of like when you see the poles that are outside of people's driveways for if it snows or something, like the reflectors. And
Yeah.
so all the people would say that this man, before he died, had all of these metal structures in his yard for the sake of his daughter or his child got hit by a car. That's what I'm saying. Like
No way.
it's so wild to see miles and miles and miles apart, these stories just continue on. So even from like
That's
ghost hunting
cool.
perspective, like when I teach Ghost Hunting 101, it's how much is our own energy feeding these stories? Like, is there even a lady who's playing a piano at the Mordecai house, or is it just sort of the tale that gets spun and the energy that we're essentially adding into the Mordecai house? Are we almost tricking ourselves into believing that she exists? It's the
Yeah.
idea of like you buy a house in the middle of nowhere, start telling people that Mary's walking around at 3 a.m. with her red dress. She may actually manifest because of just how strong the story is. So I find that
Mm.
I'm just as passionate about it as you are. I could listen to this stuff all day, but I really love the fact that it's sort of that like campfire story, hold the flashlight under your face and just the good old spooky stories.
Yeah. I really like what you're saying, by the way, about, first of all, my mind is blown. I knew there were Phantom Hitchhiker stories, but I never knew there was another like Acid Park story. That just blows my mind. And I want to definitely look into that more. But also I like what you're saying about that's the power of a story, right? A good story, whether it's a ghost story or not a ghost story, right? Those stories can come to life and you almost make it real yourself. I know my dad is really into ghost stories. He told me all kinds of ghost stories growing up about New Jersey, where he grew up. And that's why I got all into ghost stories. And but his stories were so good and so real that I really think he's created some myths that have come to life. And I'll just say that, and become part of the community. Some story he tells 30 years ago becomes a story that we're still telling 30 years later, and it's come to life.
Yeah. And I mean that's the root of what you're doing too. It's not only from that storytelling aspect, but the history. So, we talk about history in general, and I've always ne been bored of like social studies and history, but now
Yeah.
kind of appreciating that storytelling and knowing how important it is to share the story, like I think what you're doing is just such a
Mm.
cool way of doing that.
Let me tell you, and thank you, doing this book. So I started the book really just thinking I want a book,
Hmm.
right? I mean, of course I want to tell history. I mean, that's what I've been doing, but I didn't realize the magic that a book could have until I started writing it. And as I got into the process of writing it, I realized I didn't just want to be a historian who projected my own idea of history onto these ghost towns or these lost communities. But ideally, I wanted to find people who were connected to them and interview them and get their stories and have their voices in this book. Because I just don't want to be the historian that says, here's what I think the story of Henry River Mill Village means, right? Because I'm going to get it wrong. I'm going to miss the parts that were actually important to the people who lived there, right? And I may tell a great story and you may be interested in that story, but I'm still going to miss the soul of it because I wasn't there and it's not mine. So I've been really trying to find people who either lived in these places or if it's old enough that no one is still alive who lived there, at least find people whose, parents or grandparents lived there or they've got roots in that community in some way. And the stories I've been hearing, it's emotional because these are communities that are gone, and a lot of these are people who can't go back home again. And they're sharing these, like, okay, one of them, I spoke to a woman who grew up in Seaforth, which is a little town that is now under Jordan Lake. Which this is going to go into the underwater ghost stories or the underwater ghost towns. But it was amazing to hear what that place was like, right? What it was like to grow up there and to hear actual stories. Because when I tell the history, I mostly just tell the history of the New Hope River Valley and how farmers lived there. And before the farmers, the Tuscarora were there. And, it's the history. And I can tell it in an interesting way. But hearing her and like the actual personal memories of the people who lived there and some of the things I don't think these things are in the history books. They're not noted down. It's just people they're living in people's memories. And then unfortunately, people get older and they pass away and they take those stories with them and you'll never have those stories. Those stories will be wiped away if you don't capture them and talk to these people and hear their stories. I just talked to a woman today. She lived in Henry River Mill Village. Henry River Mill Village, just for those of you who don't know in the audience for listening, first of all, it's probably the most intact ghost town in North Carolina. It was built in 1905. It's beautiful. It's very when you think of a quintessential ghost town, that's what it looks like. It's got these old wooden houses, but they're in various states of decay. Some have caved in, some are still standing. The windows are kind of just wide open with, the glass has been cracked out of them. But you can look inside and see, the furniture is still in there covered in dust and um, beautiful old trees. And you can see the yards where you just know kids used to play and the mothers would hang up the laundry. And it is visually beautiful. It even has the old general store still standing. A lot of ghost towns in North Carolina are mostly gone. There's just little pieces remaining in the woods. But this one is still standing. But it's old. You can tell that it's seen better days, right? But it's still standing. And it's in such good condition that even if you've never been there, you've probably seen it. It was in the Hunger Games movie, and it was District 12 in the Hunger Games. Anyway, it's for sale now, and the people are heartbroken. They're really scared it's going to get torn down by developers. But for many years, it's been open to visitors, and you could stay the night. I found out that the reason it's in such good condition is the people who used to live there and grew up there, they've been going back and keeping it cleaned up. And like the woman I spoke with told me how her father was one of the last people to leave the village, right? And eventually he was made to leave because there's no running water, there's no plumbing, and they were like, you're not allowed to live here anymore. So he was forced to leave the home he lived in, I don't know, most of his life. She was actually born in the house there in Henry River Mill Village. So, um, but she said he kept going back. He didn't live there anymore, but he would go sit on the front porch and just kind of still continue to spend his days in this village. Um, Hearing her stories brought it to life in a way that some old newspaper clippings never could, you know. So hearing their stories just it's been very meaningful to me, and I hope that the book will not only introduce you to cool ghost towns that you can go explore, but also really help introduce you to the people who lived here, because these are places that may not be around forever. You know, some of them are already mostly gone. But it's been amazing experience and emotional. But again, it goes back to just the stories, right? The stories of these places. And even the woman I spoke with today, she said, even if the buildings get torn down, even if the homes get torn down, though it'll break her heart, she just wants to make sure that the memories and the stories keep on for generations. And I hope my book will be part of that. Small part of it, but part of it.
Absolutely. I think that that's incredible. I mean, even thinking about like, again, back to Pennsylvania, like Centralia, and that old mining town where everybody just had to get up and go because of the leak in the mines, and all of these
Mhm.
houses still have pots on stoves and clothes in closets. It's wild. And they had the entire graffiti highway that used to be there, and so you could walk all down this road, and there was this big crack in the middle of the road, which is where the kind of coal mine leak came from, and all of these people just started spray painting. So it just became this really giant art project that I'm so grateful and lucky that I was able to go and add to the spray paint and have a good time with. And now they've completely covered it with dirt. They're starting to tear down the houses. I never thought that it would be something that I cared about, but it's exactly what you're talking about of just like, wow, like you're really getting rid of something that is such a staple story. And like maybe I
Mhm.
care about that more than I thought, and I think a lot of people can resonate to that too.
Yeah, I'm literally attached to it, and I just heard about it 3 seconds ago. Like, and you're telling me about it, and I'm like, wow, that sounds amazing. I'd like to see that. And then you're like, oh, they're gonna tear it down. I don't. That's a really hard thing for me. I do understand. I understand the need for progress, and sometimes very old and decaying pieces of history are sitting on top of places that could be perhaps used for something else, right? That maybe would be useful nowadays. I understand that, but I feel like as much as possible, we should try to save the history, you know, and if you can't save the structures, I always have been a firm believer of if you can't save the structures, at least send like a team in there, get pictures of everything, do an oral history collection where you talk to all the people that lived there and like save that history, because some of these places they get wiped off the map and they get wiped out of our minds and they get wiped out of the history books and they're truly just forgotten. And those are typically the places I try to cover with my hidden history, right? To try and find these places that are really at risk of being lost forever. You know, not just torn down, but lost from our minds. But as you said, it again, it goes back to the power of the story, right? If at least their story still survives, if at least even if it becomes a legend, you know, that's a lot better than no one even remembering it was ever there and it's just gone from our collective memory.
Yeah, exactly. So the other kind of half of your storytelling is that underwater ghost story aspect. I'm kind of curious from the mermaid side of things. When I think about the word of like underwater ghost story, the first thing I think about always is like Roanoke and that idea of Croatoan and the lost colony. So
Good one.
how does something like that work into these actual sunken ghost towns?
Yeah, so I mean, so some of this, it really depends on the town, right? So, okay, for example, and this isn't a ghost story, but it's a legend. Um, there is, and I'm sure there are probably some ghost stories. It's prime for that. But let's say Lake Norman. I'm just trying to pick a favorite here. Lake Norman. Lake Norman is, I think that's actually the biggest man-made lake in North Carolina, and it covers all kinds of history. Most of the man-made lakes in North Carolina are covering communities. We'll just get that out flat. If you're swimming in one of North Carolina's popular lakes, you're probably swimming over a ghost town and probably some graves too. So there you go. If you feel something swim past you, it might have been a hand reaching and
Yeah.
um, but yeah, Lake Norman has a whole legend. Oh man, and it's so cool because the legend goes back. Okay, so we have our own Loch Ness monster in North Carolina, and it's at Lake Norman, and his name is Normie. And it almost sounds silly if you think about it, but this is one of those legends that has become part of the culture of Lake Norman, right? People go out on the boats and they have like tours, and you can go over Lake Norman, and there are like Normie tours where you can go out and look for Normie. This is a legend of a creature that lives in this enormous lake. And there has been a lot, kind of like the Devil's Tramping Ground, there's been a lot of effort put into trying to figure out what Normie is. Is this a real creature? Some people believe, now I'm not a fish expert, okay, so I may have the wrong name here, but they believe it's like maybe a giant catfish or like a sturgeon, which kind of makes sense because Lake Norman covers a Revolutionary War battlefield, right? It covers two mill villages, and there were these huge mills that were there, so it covers all that. There's an airplane underneath Lake Norman as well. I remember reading that like there's this couple who thinks it could be like their parents' airplane because they remember their parents crashed an airplane. And there are sunken cars under Lake Norman with bodies in them. So, I mean, you can pick your ghost story from those. Um, but is it possible that a catfish could have maybe lived to become a giant size because of the unusual ecosystem, right? Where it's got all kinds of hiding places. Right here near my house, we have a little lake and they drained it and it got overgrown with like plants and now the frogs are out of control, right? Well, could it be something like that where because there's possibly buildings and things down there for this catfish to live in and protect itself from predators, did it get to live and be really, really big? And now it's this monster. But the legend goes back even further. I thought it was just a legend that maybe originated in the 1970s or something. But actually, it turns out the river that feeds into Lake Norman, the indigenous tribes that lived in that area, they had a legend about a monster that lived in that river, that they said they would see this giant monster. So I think that it's the mystery, right? Is there really a monster that has been living there potentially for hundreds of years? Because again, we have indigenous tribes who remember seeing it and it's still living there today. Or is this just a legend that a lot of power has been put into it, right? Starting literally hundreds of years ago and just continuing and thriving until today. Um, Another great story, Car Lake has a crashed train underneath it. Like it's like the entire it's like a big portion of train. It's like the engine and I think the engine, the tender, and two cars. So it's a chunk of train down there and it crashed in the ni early 1900s. There were, I believe, two brothers on the train who died, and it was going over the railroad bridge. And I guess the trestle gave in, something was wrong, and the train just collapses into I believe it was a river at the time, into the river below or the creek. And then eventually it's turned into a man-made Carr Lake. And they never pulled it out. I don't know why. I don't know if they didn't have the ability to, or I'm not sure. But it's still down there under Carr Lake. So how many ghost stories could you build around this idea of this train? Or even in Lake Norman, with again, literally there are cars with bodies. And all of these have graves underneath of them. Jordan Lake, um, I clarified with the rangers there. I said, you know, did you move all of the graves? Are you sure you got them all? And they said no, because they tried with every effort to move all the graves, but this was a valley full of families who were burying their loved ones on their personal property, just on their farm. And this 3 or 4 generations later that they're going to flood the lake, and they go to the owner and go, do you know where your great 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 grandmother's buried? And they're like, somewhere in the backyard. And so some of the bodies are still under there, right? So there's a lot of creepiness and legends that can be attached to any of these lakes. Um, One of them in particular, it's not a ghost story, but underneath Roanoke Rapids Lake, there's there was a town. It wasn't even like a little tiny village. It was a bustling port town. Um, and it was called Rock Landing. And it's actually was a stop on the Underground Railroad where people were using it to escape slavery, and they would take the Roanoke Canal and go into Rock Landing and hide there. And so there's so much history in this place, and it's just been buried under a lake. So these are stories that are ripe to come to the surface and make sure that we don't just flood them and forget all about them.
Yeah. So when you're doing your research and things like that, how are you finding out that there's like trains that have fallen in lakes and graves in there? Like, how do you go about all of this research?
So, I mean, to be honest with you, I'm kind of lucky with the lake thing because I've been doing hidden history for more than 10 years now, right? I've been writing these stories. I've been writing them originally for my own website and then eventually getting picked up in magazines and ABC 11 and then WRAL and Huffington Post, CNN, and just kind of getting more and more opportunities to write about this history, right? So, because I've been writing about North Carolina history specifically for about a decade or more, I already knew about all of it. And when I say I already knew, I don't mean I immediately knew all of it, but over the course of a decade, people have contacted me, right? So, like Roanoke Rapids with Rock Landing, there's a gentleman that I know, Stephen, who he does a lot of work in historic Halifax, and I had gone to him to do a story on the Underground Railroad in Halifax. And then he's like, by the way, I'm an expert in history in this area. I know 50 other history stories for you, right? So there you go. There's your answer. I don't want to say I know all of it. It's just over the course of 10 years, yes, I've collected it. But usually, how I find a story is I will go to an expert in one part of North Carolina to talk to them about one particular story. And then they will be like, by the way, did you know about this, and this?
Hmm.
And then suddenly I know 5 more stories, 10 more stories, and I'll go back to them again and do that story. So a lot of it is finding the people like me or the people like you in each little area who are experts in their area, and they will excitedly tell me their stories, and I will excitedly tell them my stories, and then we know each other's stories and we can do what we want with them. So that's honestly most of it is word of mouth, and it starts there, and then I know what to look for from there. Once I know Roanoke Rapids Lake had this, I know how to do the research from there. Usually going into the state archives, to find the state archives is a huge help. You can contact them and say, hey, I'm doing a paper on Bloomsbury Park, and do you have any information on this old theme park that used to be standing in Raleigh in the early 1900s, and it doesn't exist anymore, but here was where it was located, and they can usually dig up like tax records and paperwork and all kinds of great stuff, pictures. So I use them a lot when doing my research, and then I also use newspapers.com. It's a paid service, but it's the best because I can do a search for say Henry River Mill Village or Rock Landing, something that is so small it's not in history books. Well,
Mm.
Henry River Mill Village is in history books, but some of these places are not in history books. Most of them aren't. That's usually I go for the ones that are not in history books, right? I'm trying to give them attention. But newspapers.com, you can literally do a little search for Rock Landing and it'll pull up some old newspaper clipping from 1880 and you'll know something you didn't know before. And it's great because it's a primary source, right? It's straight to here's what they were saying in 1880. And I found a lot of great history like that. But honestly, just like with the book, most of it is finding the people who with ties to that area, right? So with Henry River Mill Village, just as that one's on my mind because I just spoke to the woman. But I went into a group on Facebook for Henry River Mill Village Memories or something, and I said, "Does anybody here have anything they would be willing to share? Would they be willing to talk to me?" And then they'll tag five other people, and suddenly I know 20 people who know everything about that piece of history, and that helps a lot too. And that's what I really want this book to be. It's not me projecting my ideas, but oh, one more ghost story. Sorry,
Yeah.
a good underwater one. Um, so this is a great example, I think, of ghost stories as history and legend. So the Great Dismal Swamp, which borders North and South Carolina. This will be in my underwater ghost stories or ghost towns. Um, it used to be so the Underground Railroad. I've done quite a lot of research on that. It's I'm pretty fascinated in that history. And if you were a person who was trying to escape slavery along the coast of North Carolina, there were a few different paths you could take to try and get to the north or to the south. You might be traveling south. There are places down south you could go. But one of the things you could do is escape into the swamp, right? Which is today known as the Great Dismal Swamp. And at the time, it was this wild, unruly place. The water would the muck, not even just water, but like the muck would come up to like your chin, and if you'd have to really brave this swamp, right? There were snakes, alligators, coyotes, all kinds of just treacherous things out there, but it was still better than not having your freedom, right? And so people would escape into the swamp, and they knew they could get in there because the people who were working along the outside of the swamp were building a canal and they were enslaved. So the people building the canal are enslaved and they are willing to help someone who's escaping and they know that swamp better than anyone. And so they'll help you get in there and you can go into the swamp. So some people went through the swamp and just kept going north, but some people stayed living in the swamp and they formed maroon colonies. These maroon colonies were like little villages. I mean, hardly even a village, almost like a tribe. And they would live on like little islands in the middle of this swamp. Um, and the reason you might choose to stay in the swamp rather than escape north is let's say you have a loved one who's enslaved still nearby. You don't want to leave them too far behind. So you'll stay in this swamp so you don't have to go too far away. But, anyways, to help keep people out of the swamp, to protect themselves, they made up legends that spread far and wide saying that this swamp is super haunted.
Oh my
So
God.
that not only is it a scary swamp, but on top of that, it has a banshee swamp woman a swamp witch who floats through the swamp at night, and you'll see her like in her white dress and her long black hair floating through the swamp. You'll hear her shrieking like a banshee from within the, treacherous walls of the swamp. They also said that there were like these giant tangled balls made up of snakes, almost like a Medusa head, and they're huge and they would come rolling towards you and envelop you in this sphere of snakes. So they made up all these legends, these ghost stories, and the ghost stories stuck.
Mm.
but they weren't real. They were all just based on trying to scare away white people from coming and finding them and bringing them back to slavery. So I always thought that was a really fascinating like creation of a ghost story, but it goes to show you like how ghost stories and legends can play a really important role in understanding our community's history too. And this helped us understand our state's history because this really goes to show you a little tiny slice of what life may have been like if you were a person escaping slavery and living in a maroon colony. And that's part of our state history. And we don't want to let that just slip away and forget that. That's an important part of our state history. And these legends that they created still live today.
That's so awesome. I love that. And that, I mean, that goes back to, again, the power of storytelling, and even if it's not real. So
Yeah.
that's so sick. I love it. Well, cool. As we wrap up, anything that you want to add about your upcoming books?
Um, Well, first of all, just I appreciate getting to talk to you again. It's really cool being back and seeing how both of us have grown over, the amount of time it's been. It's been quite a while. And so that's been awesome. I would say just, the books aren't going to be out for a while, but when they're out, I'll be talking about them a lot. If you want to find my, keep track on when my books are going to come out, as well as just explore hidden history with me. Books aside, I still create a lot of hidden history content. I'm always out exploring forgotten or abandoned places and doing live streams, making short form video content, and of course, writing up like articles about them. So, the place I'm most actively doing that right now is my website. It's hiddenhistorian.com, not hiddenhistory.com, hiddenhistorian.com. And that website will have a link to everything else, my Instagram, my TikTok, my YouTube, my Facebook, and any of those places you'll be able to keep up with, all the cool, fun, hidden history content and spooky history content that I do, especially around October. And then it'll also let you know when the books are out if you're interested in them.
Awesome. I love it. So the first one is the hidden history of all these ghost towns, and the second one will be the underwater ghost towns.
That's right. That's right.
Love it. Well, thank you
Yeah.
for coming back, and I agree with you. The first time we had you on was 3 years ago, which is crazy.
I didn't
So,
realize it was that long.
yeah.
Wow.
So, thank you so much for coming back and continuing to share your stories, and I'm looking forward to chatting with you again for more of the underwater and any other books that come out after that too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time, next week.